If you think adoption is a dead issue, there are thousands of kids who'll tell you you're dead wrong. This is Jane Russell asking you to join me in supporting Waif.
In classic Hollywood, adoption was sometimes used to protect careers and conceal scandal. The following cases show how children were absorbed into narratives built to preserve public image over personal truth.
Now, so how do you feel now about the fact that both Christopher and I go out with Asian women?
I would have liked him from the beginning to fall in love with a nice Jewish girl.
1. Loretta Young, Judy Lewis.
Well, the first time I knew who my father was, I was 23, and I was 2 weeks away from being married.
In 1935, Loretta Young was one of Hollywood's most carefully protected stars. Bound by studio contracts, her public image emphasized Catholic virtue, moral purity, and personal restraint. During the filming of The Call of the Wild, she became pregnant by her married co-star Clark Gable. Within the rigid moral framework of the 1930s studio system, an unmarried pregnancy was widely regarded as a career-ending scandal. To prevent public exposure, Young was withdrawn from view under the explanation of a prolonged rest and travel abroad. In reality, she was taken to a secluded location where she gave birth in secrecy with the assistance of intermediaries connected to the studio system. The child, Judy, was placed into foster care and spent much of her first 19 months outside Young's home, including time in a Catholic orphanage, before Young retrieved her, limiting public visibility and potential disclosure. After the immediate risk of scandal had passed, Loretta Young legally adopted the child and presented the decision publicly as an act of charity.
I looked like my father. I had my father's very large ears. If I went in public with her, I always wore bonnets, so my ears were covered.
Judy Lewis was raised believing she was adopted until adulthood, when she learned that Loretta Young was her biological mother. In her memoir, Uncommon Knowledge, Lewis wrote that the long-maintained deception profoundly shaped her sense of identity and permanently altered her relationship with her mother.
I came home from school, walked into my living room one day, and Clark Gable was standing in the living room.
Hollywood preserved its image of moral order. The emotional cost was borne by the child. 2. Joan Crawford, Christina Crawford.
We've all seen the movie, a lot of us read the book, but only Christina lived it.
When I was a kid, there was nothing to protect children. Nothing. Unfortunately, my adoptive mother was so jealous of my success that she did everything in her power.
Christina Crawford entered Joan Crawford's household in 1939. The adoption was legally finalized in Nevada in 1940, during a period when her career and public image were being deliberately reshaped by the studio system. Publicity materials presented the adoption as evidence of Crawford's transformation into a disciplined, responsible, and morally upright woman. Carefully staged photographs of the actress with her adopted children appeared frequently in fan magazines, reinforcing the image of an orderly and exemplary Hollywood household. In her memoir, Mommy Dearest, 1978, Christina Crawford offered a sharply different account of life behind that image. She described a home environment defined by fear, rigid discipline, and emotional cruelty, alleging physical punishment, humiliation, and obsessive control over behavior, appearance, and daily routines. According to Christina, the adoption functioned less as an expression of maternal care than as an extension of control, with the child expected to conform to the demands of her mother's public persona. After Joan Crawford's death in 1977, Christina and her brother Christopher were explicitly excluded from the actress's will, a decision that was later challenged in probate, ending in a settlement. Other adopted children publicly challenged Christina's version of events, permanently fracturing the family narrative. In this case, adoption did not result in stability or belonging. Instead, it produced lasting trauma and a public dispute that surfaced only after the star was no longer able to control the story. 3. Barbara Marr, her son, Zasu Pitts. Barbara Marr was a major silent-era star whose career rose rapidly and collapsed just as quickly. By the mid-1920s, tuberculosis, addiction, and financial instability had left her gravely ill before the age of 30. Estranged from her husband and facing imminent death, she became increasingly concerned about the future of her young son. Shortly before her death in 1926, Marr arranged for the child, legally known as Marvin Carville Marr, to be permanently adopted by fellow actress Zasu Pitts and Pitts' husband Tom Gallery. This was a full legal adoption, not a temporary guardianship. Following the adoption, the boy's name was changed to Donald Michael Sonny Gallery. Newspapers framed the arrangement as an act of generosity between friends. Rarely examined was the finality of the decision. The child lost his mother, his surname, and his public association with Barbara Marr simultaneously. In public records and later press coverage after 1926, he was more often identified solely under his adopted name. In early Hollywood, even family histories could be quietly erased to preserve order and avoid scandal. Up to this point, these were individual tragedies. What follows was not personal. It was systemic. 4. Georgia Tann, Stolen Children, Hollywood-Connected Families. Georgia Tann was not an actress, but her influence extended deep into the social world surrounding Hollywood. As head of the Tennessee Children's Home Society from the 1920s until 1950, she built a nationwide adoption operation that placed infants and young children with wealthy and well-connected families across the United States. These adoptions were presented publicly as legal and charitable. In practice, many children were taken from poor or vulnerable mothers through deception, falsified consent documents, or removal under coercive or misleading circumstances. Later investigations uncovered extensive manipulation of records. Birth certificates were altered, original identities erased, and biological parents were falsely informed that their children had died. Adoption fees were quietly collected, cases were expedited through cooperative or insufficiently scrutinized court processes, and oversight by social services was minimal or compromised. Adoptive households included politicians, members of the legal system, and families with connections to the entertainment industry, though many identities were sealed or deliberately obscured. The system relied on silence, social respectability, and the prevailing belief that affluent homes were inherently superior. When the operation finally became the subject of public investigation in 1950, after years of ignored complaints, Georgia Tann died before criminal charges could be pursued. Thousands of adoptees were left with fabricated identities and no reliable access to their origins. This was not an isolated abuse, but an industrial-scale rewriting of family histories, one that functioned openly for decades while authorities and society failed to intervene. 5. Mary Pickford, Ronald and Roxanne. Mary Pickford was internationally celebrated as America's sweetheart, a symbol of innocence, optimism, and emotional warmth during Hollywood's formative decades. When she and her husband Buddy Rogers adopted 2 children, Ronald in 1943 and Roxanne in 1944, the press presented the adoptions as a natural extension of her carefully cultivated public identity. They were widely framed as reassuring national stories of domestic harmony and moral stability. Biographical sources and later testimony from the children describe a markedly different private environment. Pickford maintained strict discipline and high behavioral standards, while emotional expression within the household was tightly controlled. Affection was limited, criticism frequent, and the children were expected to conform closely to the idealized family image associated with her public persona. As adults, both Ronald and Roxanne spoke about the lasting emotional impact of growing up under constant expectation and restraint. Behind the carefully preserved image of Hollywood's most beloved star, adoption became another structured role, one defined by obedience, silence, and emotional containment rather than sustained parental intimacy. 6. Jane Russell, International Adoptions, Legal Chaos. Jane Russell publicly promoted adoption as a moral and religious mission. In the 1950s, following her own experience as an adoptive mother, she founded the World Adoption International Fund, Waif, presenting it as a humanitarian initiative intended to place children from abroad into American homes. Russell spoke frequently about faith, compassion, and moral responsibility, framing international adoption as a personal obligation and a moral cause. In practice, the organization became entangled in legal and ethical complications. Waif operated during a period when international adoption lacked consistent regulation, leading to unclear documentation, disputed parental consent, and cases in which children were transferred across borders without uniform legal safeguards. Several adoptions associated with the organization resulted in court challenges and government scrutiny, revealing systemic vulnerabilities rather than isolated administrative failures. These cases formed part of a broader era of controversy that increased public and institutional attention to international adoption practices. Russell maintained that her intentions were sincere, and no evidence suggests she personally profited from the operation. Nevertheless, the consequences were significant. Families were separated, children were left in prolonged legal uncertainty, and the idealized narrative of humanitarian rescue gave way to bureaucratic confusion and lasting harm. Even when driven by conviction and goodwill, adoption proved capable of producing irreversible damage. 7. Barbara Stanwyck, Dion Anthony Stanwyck, Dion Anthony Fay. Barbara Stanwyck adopted a baby boy, Dion Anthony Fay, in 1932 while married to actor Frank Fay. Publicly, the adoption aligned with the studio-preferred image of stability. A successful actress, a respectable household, and a child symbolizing domestic normalcy. Beyond brief announcements, the press devoted little attention to the matter. From the outset, the child's life was treated as private and deliberately kept separate from Stanwyck's carefully managed public persona. The marriage ended a few years later, and custody arrangements became increasingly unsettled. Biographical accounts indicate that Stanwyck's relationship with Dion grew distant as he entered adolescence. He spent extended periods living away from her, and regular contact diminished. Unlike many celebrity children of the era, he was never incorporated into her public image or presented as part of her professional legacy. In adulthood, Dion distanced himself from his adoptive mother and avoided public association with her. He rarely spoke publicly, but available biographical accounts suggest that a sustained emotional bond never fully developed. In this case, adoption functioned primarily as a legal arrangement without lasting emotional continuity. A child formally accepted, then quietly removed from the narrative once he no longer fit the structure of the star's life. 8. Bette Davis, Margot Merrill. Bette Davis and actor Gary Merrill adopted Margot Merrill in 1951. From early childhood, Margot exhibited severe cognitive and developmental disabilities, a reality that stood in stark contrast to Davis's formidable public image as a forceful and uncompromising star. Unlike many Hollywood adoptions, this one was never incorporated into publicity narratives. Margot's existence remained largely outside public view. As the extent of her condition became clear, Margot was placed in specialized care facilities, where she spent most of her life. Davis spoke of her daughter only rarely and in carefully restrained terms. Studio-era journalism avoided the subject almost entirely, reflecting both the stigma surrounding disability at the time and Hollywood's broader discomfort with realities that disrupted its image of control, strength, and success. Margot lived much of her life almost entirely outside her mother's public world, spending the majority of her life in institutional care. There were no redemptive storylines and little public reassessment. This adoption did not become a scandal, nor a sentimental narrative. Instead, it receded into near silence, a life shaped by absence and an industry largely unwilling to acknowledge vulnerability when it could not be transformed into image. 9. Laura Lee Michelle, Adoption, Court Case, Disappearance. Laura Lee Michelle was a child actress who appeared in several Hollywood films in the late 1940s and early 1950s. Born Virginia Joy Williford in 1940, she was adopted at a young age by Otto and Lorraine Michelle, who assumed direct control over her acting career. From an early stage, her life became subject not only to studio contracts, but also to legal and child welfare oversight. In 1950, a custody and welfare case reached the courts following allegations that Laura Lee was being mistreated by her adoptive parents. Claims included physical punishment and restrictive control over her diet and daily routines, reportedly linked to maintaining her suitability for child roles. Accounts in contemporary reporting were conflicting, and the child's own statements were inconsistent. The court ultimately declined to revoke the adoption, and custody remained with the Michaels. Laura Lee's film career soon collapsed. As an adult, she experienced ongoing instability, was briefly incarcerated for car theft in the early 1960s, and then largely disappeared from public records. Later reports suggested she may have died of cancer in the late 1970s, though surviving documentation remains incomplete. Her adoption did not result in protection or long-term stability. Instead, it ended in silence, unresolved questions, and a life lost between Hollywood's production system and the limits of legal intervention. 10. Mia Farrow, Soon-Yi Previn. Soon-Yi Previn was adopted by Mia Farrow and her then-husband Andre Previn in 1978. Raised in a large household that included both biological and adopted children, she grew up largely outside the public spotlight. Unlike some of Farrow's children, Soon-Yi was not involved in acting and remained mostly private throughout her youth. In the early 1990s, it became public that Soon-Yi, then a young adult, was in a romantic relationship with Woody Allen, Mia Farrow's long-term partner. Although Allen was neither her adoptive nor legal parent, the disclosure triggered an international scandal. The relationship was lawful, but it profoundly disrupted public assumptions about family boundaries and raised lasting ethical questions concerning power, proximity, and trust within complex adoptive family structures. Soon-Yi later married Allen and publicly defended the relationship, while Farrow described the discovery as a devastating personal betrayal. The adoption itself had been legal and conventional, yet its outcome became one of the most disturbing family ruptures associated with Hollywood. What began as an act of care ended in permanent division, leaving no version of the story untouched by lasting damage. These adoptions were not isolated anomalies, but part of a legal and socially accepted system. Behind Hollywood's carefully maintained image, children were moved, renamed, and absorbed into narratives designed to protect reputation rather than truth.